Hey friends, it's Melvin. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Here's just a few quick things I wanted to notify you guys about before we get started. First up, very soon, new episodes will be releasing Wednesday mornings rather than Tuesday. So don't panic if you don't see a new episode on Tuesday. Just wait a little longer and you'll see it in your feed. Second, we've introduced a mailbag. Check those show notes and toward the bottom you'll see a mailbag link. You'll then be able to text us any questions you might have about movies, the movie industry, or any movie/Christian related questions you might have. Then we'll respond in a future episode, so send us your questions now. Up next, Patreon polls, which are available to Patreon supporters at the $3 tier or higher, have been updated. Supporters can now suggest films or shows to be reviewed at the end of each month. The two most liked submissions will become the options for the Patreon poll. So if you want to hear us talk about your favorite movie or show, join our Patreon and start campaigning. And lastly, whether you're a new or longtime listener, please consider writing a review or rating the Cinematic Doctrine podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Apart from financially supporting on Patreon, these are the two most helpful ways to support the show. And that's it. Enjoy the episode. You're listening to Cinematic Doctrine. Hey, if you just press play, you're missing out on 45 minutes of extra content. This is content that's exclusive to Patreon supporters. Each episode, we always start the episode, each movie discussion and party pleaser episode, that is, we always have a discussion prior to the main episode that is exclusive to Patreon supporters. And in this particular one, for 45 minutes, we talk about AI, which obviously has consistently been a topic discussed across the world over. But we decided to look back to mid-May 2024 when Google had released their AI overview program, where instead of having to pay for Bard, which is their, ChatGPT equivalent app, you would just Google something and at the very top, it would just be an AI responding to you about your search inquiry. You would scroll lower to get to the, web pages you were trying to find, but it would respond with really bonkers answers. One of the ones I didn't collect, but I'll reference here, was somebody who would search like, what is the healthy amount of rocks to eat per day? And it just responded like one small pebble a day. And it gave reasons for why. And of course, that's not a good idea. It's like, you're bonkers. This is ridiculous. So I collected a couple of these and titled them based on like how this AI didn't understand morality, how this AI didn't understand sarcasm, how the AI is just plain incorrect, and a series of other things. We have a lot of laughs. There's a lot of ridiculousness here because it's just funny to imagine some person coming up to you earnestly telling you things that are just ridiculously. It's pretty funny. And that's exclusive to Patreon supporters. So go to patreon.com/cinematic doctrine. Pick any tier, but the minimum is $3, and you gain access to that 45-minute discussion, as well as several other discussions and several other perks and benefits. But you press play because you wanted to hear us talk about Cube, or maybe because you're thinking, why are they talking about Cube? Other than the fact that it's a classic, Melvin has a podcast and he gets to choose what we talk about. So we're going to do that. But just some quick primer to this episode. I'm here with Kathryn for this episode. Hey, Kathryn, what is going on?
Not much. I now know not to trust AI. And here we are to talk about a movie that is roughly the same age as I am.
Yeah, that's right. What, 98, 97? When did it come out? I forgot to check, but...
So it was at TIFF in 97 and then got wide release 98.
That sounds about right. Yeah, so Cube, we're just talking about Cube because like it's been on my mind lately. There was a show I listened to that talked about every movie. I hadn't watched it probably since the first year of our marriage, maybe even before that. And I was just interested in kind of just rewatching this movie that's based in a genre that I really enjoy. I really enjoy genres that are the genre of characters stuck in an impossible to escape scenario is what I call it. And that is very much Cube. For those who are for the uninitiated, Cube is a 1997 Canadian sci-fi horror movie, sci-fi thriller, in which a collection of people wake up inside of this cube-looking shaped device. and their clothing is gone. They're wearing like these like smocks, these like very neutral smocks,
Jumpsuits. Yeah.
jumpsuits. They have they're stuck. They don't know what's in there. There are traps in the cubes. Depending on pardon, they're in a one cube, but beside them on each what's the faces of a cube? It's not quadrants. Gosh, the geometry teacher that
Oh
trained
no.
me, they're losing their minds in middle school. The faces of the cube, each one has a hole, and they can the top, bottom, left, right, front, back, and they can go through it. But the risk is that each cube next to each cube may potentially be trapped, and these traps are very dynamic. They're very much like proto Saw traps, where like you could walk in and then these needles show up, and out of nowhere you're punctured. Or the opening scene to set up the tone of the film is a man walks through a cube, he steps inside, and then like he you hear like a, and then he like starts to bleed, but across like cubed like shapes, and then his body falls apart into tiny cubes, kind of like the death in Resident Evil.
It's like the trap slap, like the infomercial thing.
The slap chop. You're talking about the slap
slap
chop.
chop. Yeah, slap chop.
It's like that mixed with like one of the egg slicers where you close it down and the needles cut the egg into like slices. So the point is these traps are fatal, but they're also particularly gruesome, and these people don't know how they got inside the cube. All they know is they want to get out. And you have a different cast of characters. One of them seems to be like a high schooler. One of them is like a cop. The other person is like a professor. There's like a tech guy who's in there. And the film is very much just their social dynamics as they're trying to figure out how to escape this cube, and also like the perpetual threat and mystery of the cube itself. And that's it. It's a super high concept movie. That is to say, like, it's a very simple, plain, practical thing. Like, it's just, hey, what if people woke up in a cube and it had traps and they couldn't get out? And that's the movie. Very brisk 90 minutes. The first time I watched it, it was not as good as I was expecting it to be. But this time watching it, it was amazing. I really, really, really enjoyed it. But before getting into what I think, I want to know what you think. Kathryn, what do you think about Cube?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me from Cube, especially compared to other movies that kind of fit the genre, were just how well the like director, the actors, the set designers like understood the tone and the vision. It's really unsettling at parts. There's some like more subtle visual effects that are used throughout the film, like the cube itself is kind of backlit and it changes colors depending on which cube they're located in, and maybe some tonal things that are happening between our characters. And yeah, there's just a very oppressive vibe to the whole thing, where as soon as it starts, you're convinced that the characters are stuck here forever. It's neo-futuristic in a weird, uncomfortable way that immediately makes you wonder, like, how did these people get here? Why are they here? Why is this cube in existence?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think just one of the things that really blew me away was learning more about how the cube was constructed, where basically it was like 1.5 cubes that they had constructed, like one primary cube.
You're talking the real cube on the set, not the
not the
cube they talk about in the film.
Not the royal cube.
Yeah,
not the cube within cubes. To visualize it for our listeners, imagine a Rubik's cube where it's multiple smaller cubes on one face of a much larger cube.
Yes, yeah, and there's but the cube itself, the set is there is a single room that they're shooting in. And whenever the camera is facing one of the openings that they can peer through, if it is open, they have like a one extra side that they can put on that like wall or on the other side of the opening to give you the illusion that the cube that there's another cube beyond, which is just a really efficient way of constructing your set and then using movie magic to create this claustrophobic and yet never ending set that it feels that way. Because like you said, they change the lights. So like you're shooting the scene in a white cube. And then when they open the door, they can see the other faced outside and it's red. And so you're like, oh, that's a red cube. And so then they walk into it.
Yeah.
And now all they've had to do is change some gel lights surrounding the cube and turn it red. And they don't have to make a second one. Why waste the money? And so then if they just have to move the camera around or move that particular side to different positions to continue to preserve the illusion, which never goes away. I think that's like one of the most effective parts of the film is like, you're always trapped. It's just like, it's really impressive.
Yeah. And this might sound like very high accolade for a sci-fi horror movie from the 90s, but there are times where it felt like something like from Alfred Hitchcock, where it's very simple, very structured as far as again, like how the set is set up, the characters were given. It's like simple but stark in a very good way.
Bold. Yeah. Hey, don't forget, there's a lot of fun content missing from this episode because you're not listening on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/cinematic doctrine and support for $3 a month to gain access to uncut episodes with upwards of 40 minutes of bonus content each. You'll thank me later.
The other thing that I would say stood out to me was obviously like the characters. We have, oh boy, how many characters?
I want to say 6.
I believe it's
roughly.
6, one for each side of the cube.
Oh, I didn't think of that. That'd be interesting. There is a 7th, but that's the guy who dies in the beginning.
Yes,
so
yes.
It's really 6.
Yeah, so anyways, like the characters that we do get to experience the cube with are very memorable. Again, like very stark archetypes of certain characters, giving them basically descriptors like, clinic doctor, but this very general description, or like police officer, very general description. The more time we spend with these characters, the more that they kind of build into more realized people. We get to learn more things about them. Like I thought it was very chuckle-worthy that the clinic doctor is also like a conspiracy believer. And like obviously from their work in the clinic, they're like painfully altruistic. Like they'll do anything for these strangers they just met.
Yes.
So yeah, that was another thing that I thought was done really well.
Yeah, I like I said, this movie was better than I remembered by all accounts. I almost thought it was like when I finished the movie, I went back to my Letterboxd review from like 6 years ago, and I was shocked that I gave it a 5 out of 10. That was like unbelievable.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. So it's like an 8 now. Because I'm like, what am I what am I nuts? Forgive me for the sins of my youth. But
that was your cage stage of movie loving.
Probably like where it's like, the movie wasn't about anything. The movie didn't have compelling characters.
Like me for the past 2 years.
Yeah, well, there was a long period. It probably started with Incredibles 2, which I thought was just fine. I didn't think it was great. I wish it was better. But you were like, that sucked. And I was like, what are you talking about?
I go to see a Pixar movie for kids and families, and I go, that didn't wow me.
Yeah.
What were you expecting? I don't know, something incredible.
Incredible, I guess. Yeah, you're probably correct. And now I'm a lot more freeform and comfortable with like all kinds of movies. And this one definitely wowed me in much more respects because I think I just better digest films. Like I better understand how to engage with different types of movies. And this one, I just engaged a lot better. I think the film, the rewatch came out with some clarity and like increased enjoyment. The whole atmosphere and the overwhelming vibe and the intrigue is just was a lot better. I was fascinated by the cube. Like it's this device that's like logical and like can be understood, but like the more that these characters understand the cube, because it's like a puzzle as they're trying to figure out what's safe and what's not, it becomes like almost overwhelming because like as the characters are exploring the cube and trying to figure out which rooms are a trap and which ones are not, one of the first things you learn is one of the characters will throw his boot, holding it by the lace. He'll throw it in a room, and if a trap is triggered, he pulls the boot back, which is probably now, seared to a crisp or has been cut in half and something. He's like, okay, we don't go in there. And then he throws the boot into another room and tries again. And then if the boot doesn't get incinerated, they'll go into the room and it'll be fine. But at some point, like, they learn that there's more to the cube that they need to understand to figure out which rooms are safe or why they're safe. Like, are the traps triggered by something other than just people entering them, or something entering them? And it's all possible to quote unquote beat the cube, but it's insurmountable because of the amount of work that it takes to do it. And that's all on top of the fact that, like, as the film progresses, our characters look more tired. They look more more spiritually exhausted. They get chapped lips. So the weather, like, there's no temperate weather. There's no like, probably not air conditioning. It's just awful. The characters look just disgusting by the end of the film. They're not bathed. You don't know how many hours it's been or even days. So it's just, and probably by the time the movie ends, it's probably been 3 days, probably been 2.5 days, is my presumption. And so there is just a lot to it that, like, makes the whole film from start to end a very precise project. And so in my opinion, I just think, like, the movie, it's just really, really well directed. And that makes the movie really, really enjoyable to watch. I looked up, and there's two different numbers here, but I took the one. $700,000 was the budget for Cube. To my knowledge, I remember hearing that this was basically this will require some double checking. So editing, Melvin, check this out online, double check me. And if this is still in the episode, I guess it's true. But I believe that this was a project made out of college, and the particular college program would, like, pick one of the students' films or projects to make into a film. And this was the one. So then, like, all these different departments are then working together to make the film. Editing Melvin to the rescue. This is somewhat true. It wasn't a college that helped produce the film, but the Canadian Film Centre, a charitable cultural organization in Toronto. It seems the program acts as a mediator between aspiring creators and established industry partners. The anecdote that I had heard is that a group of people will pitch individual ideas for the program to support, and then one will be selected. Cube, in this case, was one such selected project. And back to your regularly scheduled episode. And all of that just, like, comes together here and works really well. On top of that, the direction is really good. The director is Vincenzo Natali. He's worked on other films like Cypher. Splice would probably be his most recent popular film. The acting is well handled and performed. To create more creativity with the visuals, there's different use of lenses, different use of framing, the colors, of course, of the cubes we mentioned, the kinds of traps or the kinds of way we're following our characters. The makeup department, as mentioned, the characters look worse as the film goes on. There's just all of these details that come together that, like, there are more expensive films with people who have more complicated careers that don't produce material as well directed and put together as Cube does. And it's part of why I was so compelled to be like, I wanted to do an episode on it before watching the movie again, because I was just interested in maybe doing that. But then watching the movie, I was like, we have to, because, like, this is an amazing expression of, like, really good directing.
I definitely agree that the directing is very spot on. Like, you can tell that Vincenzo Natali just had, like, a very clear vision and knew how to accomplish that with, like, the actors he had on board.
Yeah, one of my things was I there's definitely some scenes that are like, every frame of painting, where it's like the director set them up to stand a particular point a certain way, talk a certain way. But there's also a lot of scenes too where it really feels like he went, no, I think you got this. And he lets the actor just perform it as they interpret it. And, like, even that requires a lot of patience and understanding. And then in the editing room to make those decisions on which cut to use is It's a lot of work and impressive to keep that perceived momentum, I should say, because, I wasn't there. I can only look at the final result, which is, the film. You may not know this, but the easiest way you can show your support for Cinematic Doctrine is to rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. So press pause and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And then press play again so you can hear the rest of the show. Moving forward, what did the movie evoke in you? So yeah, what did it draw out?
I think to me, like, one of the biggest things that stood out to me was how uneasy I felt watching it. And I feel like that unease kind of escalated over the course of the film.
Yeah.
Like, again, you kind of enter this cube situation and you find out like all the cubes are trapped. So every single time a character opens the door, or a door opens while a character's in the cube and someone else comes through, you're like, oh no, what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
And again, like, this escalates over the course of the film. Not in that the film gets more graphic per se, but like, I do remember there was one point where I just said out loud, I looked at you and I was like, oh no, is someone about to be like assaulted? And
Yeah.
like sexually assaulted? Did not happen. But everybody's like at their wits' end by the end of the film. And again, like, makeup department just totally killing it with making everybody look like it's their worst day on earth. So it's again, like, super convincing. You get that sense of unease, and it leaves you wondering when the boot's going to drop, which,
Got him.
Like, as you'd mentioned, one of the characters is constantly throwing the boot into the other room and waiting to see what happens before pulling it back by the strings. So it's literally, we're just waiting to see what's going to happen when those boots are dropping.
And to just further go on that, you reacted. There was that where you turned to me and were like, this is like really freaky. But there was also another scene too where, like, it's a transition scene and something took place where, like, a person got injured, and it was like a shock because it was like, is it a trap? Is it a person? What's happening here? And I remember both of us, because I didn't remember the scene, audibly reacted to it. Yeah, it's paced well. Like, on top of all of these other things, that it, like, the film never gets it's never exhausting or like exhaustive. It keeps its good pace that, like, keeps you intrigued. It has its break points where, like, this is a trap room, or this is a weird thing going on, or this is some downtime for characters to talk, or this is some tension, and it's paced well in that regard, that, like, by the time you're getting to the ending stuff, it's hard to even, like, guess where it's going to go. And that adds to a lot of good shocks. But what else do you got?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree, like, with the pacing constantly. Like, you're in emotional lockstep with the characters. Like, here's where they are. Totally believable. Great directing, great pacing. I would say obvious to me, maybe odd in other ways, comparison that I had drawn was to Eraserhead. And the reason why I had drawn that, association was because of really just like the sound design and the set design of the cube. There's no Mother Nature anywhere. There's the organic softness is just totally stripped out of the movie. There's no crying baby on the dresser, but there might as well be. Every single like creak of metal or like whoosh of air that comes through the vent, like, it stands to remind you that, like, there's no humanity here. There are humans in this cube, but, really, is there any humanity here? Something that I thought was really neat about the actual film production was that it was shot near a train yard. So some of the sounds that you hear over the course of the filming were just naturally sounds going on in the train yard, like right next to where they were filming in the warehouse.
That's funny.
And yeah, I think, the more that you're kind of stripped away from those natural things, it gives you more space to kind of wonder with the characters about more moral things that happen over the course of their time spent in the cube together. The police officer might think he's like a really great person, but just wait and see, like, what kind of ugliness comes out of a person, even a person that thinks they're a good person,
right,
when they're put through really difficult situations. it's even something where like the characters are wondering, like, is this a punishment? And then, we're kind of left there to wonder with them and explore with them as they, go over the course of the journey in the cubes.
It's this film that like it's like a test of endurance, and all of these characters have like a breaking point or maybe don't, and like we're starting to see where that's going to approach. And yeah, the characters are both trying to figure out perhaps the comprehension as to why comprehend as to why the cube exists at all, but also are having to also accept the fact that like it doesn't matter, we're stuck, like we need to get out.
Yeah.
And we can think about it some other time, which I think is it's an interesting showcase of a very natural thing where like I heard it described this way on a podcast talking about Joe Biden being old, where it was Joe Biden being old and Trump being a liar, where it was something like they described Democrats are the people in the NBA who are looking up the rule book saying why dogs can't play basketball. Meanwhile, the dog is dunking on them over and over and over. And it's like, yeah, you can look up the reason why. It doesn't matter. He's still scoring points on you, buddy. Like, it doesn't matter what the rule books say. And so you have this, not to get political or anything, but you have this.
You just got air butted.
You have this interesting way of exploring that idea. I think like the fact that they're spending time thinking about why the cube exists is important. It's also part of the intrigue of why, as an audience, we're watching the movie. Like that's part of that's like inherently why Cube is so fascinating as a movie. You're like, these people are trapped in a cube and there's traps. And it's not just traps, there's like crazy stuff. And the characters are like, are we on TV? And like, you would have to think that because some of these traps are like spectacle kills. They're not like, oh, you just fall in and you collapse because they took the oxygen out or something. It's like acid burns or like, I don't know, flames, or I think there was like another one later. So
there's one that it's like strings, like these metal.
Oh, the twisting?
Like, yeah, these like metal strings that come out of the center of the cube and then they twist. Right. Into like this braid almost, and if you're caught in the middle of it, like you're just annihilated.
And so like a part of that is like, why have so much spectacle if nobody was watching? And like, so then there's this mystery of like, then who is watching other than the audience? And the film isn't like metatextual. You could read that in if you wanted, but like, it's not the point of the movie. And the movie even is comfortable with that too. For me, what it evoked, I just had like the getting lost in the corporate systematic sauce is what I wrote. I wrote, the cube exists likely due to a collection of outsourced projects and ideas coming together under the duct tape of NDAs and need-to-know cases. So you have this thing that's so massive, but it's super secretive, and no one inside the cube knows why it exists. And one theory is that even on the outside, nobody really knows why it's there either, but it's just been built, so why not use it? And apart from so then my market brain starts thinking, apart from the gig economy angle present in the character Worth's backstory and the general presumption about the cube, we don't know if the cube is a government or a private sector thing. We only know that it's a collective work of countless people. The collective work of countless people can also produce something horrible. And sometimes people don't ask when they're working on projects, so there isn't even anything for them to tell about. It's just how we do things is kind of something I wrote. Which has led to the creation of the cube under this theory, of course. And if humanity can permit something like this to be possible, what does it say about humanity that it's permitted at all? The cube then exists as evidence of a system which naturally produces ignorance and threat, not knowing why the cube exists, but that any stranger could be put inside of it makes it a threat at all. Because anybody, like the characters are random, it seems. They're semi-random. They each have skills. They each have something that they can do, as they perceive at least. But it's also still random, and I think anybody could fit into any of the categories given out of this list of characters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like this cast is like, not buzzword diverse, but yes, diverse. Like, yeah, there are women, there are men, there are older people, younger people. There are people with intellectual disabilities. Like,
it's like everybody.
It's like it's a whole spectrum of different types of people that are sent into this cube, essentially.
Enjoying this episode? Grab that share link and tell your friends. Word of mouth is the most effective way for a podcast to reach new listeners, so don't be shy. Share the episode wherever you can. To get into more specific spoilers, so we're going to be thinking like things like kind of the end of the film, thinking like more character revelations that take place later. I don't think the movie's going out of its way to actually talk about like corporate greed. I mean, most sci-fi does, but like, I don't think it's overtly. I think that's part of the mode of sci-fi. But like, or even systematic issues. But it proposes fascinating like angles to like, if Worth actually was participating in creating the cube as he is worried he may have been, then there's this like exploration of the way in which a collective group of people following rules may or may not realize that they've produced something evil or awful. And this can be incidental or accidental. This can be, I just did it because I need to make money. Like I just need to survive. And so it just, to me, it evokes like an encouragement to, you know, increase knowledge, be aware of what you're doing if you can, but also like, you know, NDAs and need to know bases, they do exist. But what are you thinking?
I think to kind of summarize what you were saying, you know, being able to take a look at the more systemic issues that come out of our individual contributions or can come out of individual contributions, especially whenever, I mean, the cube's just a perfect example. It's, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of people might have worked on this, and they're only working on, you know, a fraction of the actual thing. But whenever it all comes together in this larger system, it's something that's like gnarly and like terrifying.
Right. And may not even be, the scope might not be immediately perceived. And then the amount of work it takes to get out of it may not involve everybody. And I think that is a good metaphor for a lot of very unfortunate institutions or social standards that people operate in. And so, yeah, not a main point of the film, not even necessarily a main point of why I enjoy the film. I don't think it's I don't think it fits into the category, or I would never earnestly use the category elevated horror. I would never say that earnestly. But I think if someone were to force a read like that, I think, you know, that would work. But yeah, any recurring symbols, iconography, motifs, instrumentation, catchphrases, anything you're picking up on? What'd you get?
Well, I don't know if we like really established any of our characters.
No, not overtly.
Not overtly. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, like the lineup of characters that we do have, just like a factoid about all of our characters. Again, it's a super diverse group of characters, varying ages, gender. We're introduced to all of these separate characters, and fun fact is they're all named after prisons or things associated with famous prisons.
With prison, yeah.
Yeah. So Alderson is the first character that we meet that just pretty much immediately is gone.
Yeah.
We only know his name is Alderson because we see his name tag has been is like, yeah, he has like a name tag on his shirt.
Yeah.
Like I don't think it's a jumpsuit, but it's like his little shirt. He's named after a minimum security prison in West Virginia. Nothing like really to write home about. We have our characters Levin and Worth. Levin is the young college student who is a math whiz, which will come in handy later.
Mm-hmm.
And then Worth is our corporate buddy who is really disappointed to be here in the cube and also recognizing maybe he shouldn't have taken that last gig. But
yeah.
Their names combined together, Levin and Worth, are the federal Leavenworth prison, which was the largest maximum security prison from 1903 to 2005. So a little over 100 years, largest max security prison. Another character we're introduced to later on is Kazan. He's named after a city that housed a high security psychiatric hospital in the USSR. When I went to go search this online, it was really difficult to find information, partially because people thought that Kazan was the name of the prison and not the name of the town. And also because it has to do with records with the USSR and the information that's available online freely. So anyway, when I did my digging, the psychiatric hospital that was in Kazan was well known for having political dissidents wrongfully brought into the psych hospital and diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it was essentially a prison, but it's technically a psych hospital.
Hashtag lobotomy.
Basically.
Yeah.
So that knocks out 4 of our characters. We have a couple more. There's Quentin, who is our resident police officer. He's named after San Quentin State Prison in California. And yeah, that's the same San Quentin that Johnny Cash performed at. And then, yeah, the other thing interesting to note about San Quentin is it was the last death row in California. So in 2019, there was a moratorium on capital punishment in California. So it's still technically legal to death sentence someone, but they're not going through with any of the death sentences since 2019. We have 2 more. We have Holloway, who is a clinic doctor, older woman, and they're named after a women's only prison in England.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I thought was interesting about like this namesake was that this was a prison where early suffragettes were imprisoned. And also Holloway Prison was like famous for having compassionate and comprehensive discharge planning for the ladies that were imprisoned there. Like they had hostels that they would be discharged to. They offered psychotherapy, a coffee bar, and this was like years and years and years ago.
Fascinating. That's probably be a really interesting book to read on that.
And then we have last character is Renz, who is our boot wielding escape artist.
Mm-hmm.
And he's named after a French prison that was often presented as being like the model prison establishment. Like your best case scenario, like this is what a prison ought to look like.
Can you say that in a French accent? Centre Penitentiaire de Rennes.
No, I can't. I can't.
All.
I'm not going to try.
It's funny that that's the model prison establishment, like the ideal, and then that's the character that, like we open spoilers. That's the character who's escaped 7 or 8 prisons, and then he gets obliterated like 20 minutes in the movie. It's a good scene. It's funny and also very upsetting. It's
very upsetting because you think like, oh, if there's anyone that can get out of here, it's this guy with this crazy guy with his boot.
He like found a way to like try something, right? Like everyone else is figuring out what to do and he's already got an idea, and then boom, dead.
Well, and he also like, one of the things that's interesting about this movie is like all the characters are sucking on buttons.
Yes. Yeah.
And I can't remember if it's Ren or if it's Holloway that's like, just suck on the button because then you won't get thirsty.
Renz recommends it, and that was actually something I meant to mention in the director thing was I forget. There was an interesting video I remember watching where it was twins were at like an art museum, and 2 twins were sitting next to each other, one chewing gum, one not chewing gum, and then there was a questionnaire in front basically saying which one do you think is like probably more fun to hang out with or whatever. And each set of twins had a different question, but usually it was choose like the one that seemed happier, and they always picked the one chewing gum, almost always. And one of my thoughts I had was by having your characters suck on these buttons, you gave them something to do when they don't have props. And there's facial there's a dynamic facial aspect to every actor throughout the film because they're constantly sucking on these buttons because they're hungry and they don't get to have food. They're thirsty and they don't get to have water. Anyways, that was just an interesting, it's like a bizarre touch to the film that I think adds a lot of dynamism. Dynamic dynamism. There is a word
Dynamite.
though that's
dynamism. No. I don't
like struggling.
Now I'm all mixed up.
Yeah. Oh man. Cinematic Doctor, baby. That's what it's all about. Hey listener, we've got a mailbag now. Open those show notes, scroll down a little, and you'll see a mailbag link. Press it and send us a text with a question and your first name, and we'll answer it in a future episode. So if any questions pop up while you're listening to the rest of this episode, you know what to do. We'd love to hear from you. I know you have one other one. I want to jump in real quick.
Yeah.
I had for like recurring symbols and motifs, whatever. I had coloring was one of them. So very naturally, the colors are changing from cube to cube. Not changing, but they are just different colored cubes. And each color seems to correlate to how the scene is kind of going to unfold. There is like one narrative thing that makes that very clear. I forget. I think it's Kazan who's the mentally challenged
Yes.
patient. He's afraid of red rooms, and he prefers blue rooms, and that's just like a narrative thing that's not pointed at or anything. But it is true that like there is something fearful to be had in the red rooms because each character seems to be noticeably frustrated whenever they're in the red rooms. It seems to add to the tension of their frustration and the heat of the drama is heightened there. And then the blue rooms seem to be much more relaxed and chill. And then there's white rooms too, which to my memory are pretty much more informational, conversational. And then the other thing I had at least was I felt that the film, so as the film continues, numbers become huge. They become such a huge focus here, to a point that might be almost like shocking because there aren't many movies where math is a big deal. But this movie, like at some point, it's a math movie. Basically, between each cube, when they open up the door, there is a set of like almost like what's the serial numbers is what they look like.
Yes.
Between the cubes where they meet. And they soon start to realize that the serial numbers represent the spaces within. So there's the cube they're inside and then the cubes surrounding them. But then they learn that there's ends to the cubes, presumptively, based on like these serial numbers, which don't just read like serial numbers, but they're actually like, I think they said they're like points within the cube itself. So like I think the cube is like 15 by 18. It's massive, which means like by I forget how, it's not surface area because that would be a 2D place. I don't know what I think it's volume.
Square footage.
I don't know. It's massive, this cube. And they're realizing there's a correlation between these numbers and the trapped rooms. And they're like, oh, it's prime numbers. So like at some point there's a montage of these characters looking at these numbers and having to do the mental math to be like, is there a prime number? Yes. All right, don't go in there. It's just like it's amazing. And to me, I just was thinking out like this massive emphasis on math in the film. It's not like it's not like a talking point, but the fact that the math exists, I'm trying to figure out how to transition what I was thinking to what I wrote. So I'm just going to read what I wrote now. I said there's a heavy emphasis. That's like the problem with sometimes prepping notes is like I want to figure out how to naturally have a podcast and just converse. But then also I like what I wrote, so I want to read it too. Anyways, let's just read it. I wrote, numbers are definitive. I said there is a heavy emphasis on math in the film for obvious reasons, but not necessarily as a talking point. Rather, the math exists to make the cube more interesting as a device. Even so, the human characters are filled with flaws and secrets and goals, but the numbers in the cube are static. Even the way the cube alternates, when observed broadly, is static, as it only moves in a particular pattern. Meanwhile, the humans are unpredictable and occasionally irrational. I've been thinking specifically about numbers in this way that, like in my own life, I've thought about this too. I'm not like doing math, although I find math fascinating. But like numbers as someone who, works retail. So I think about how numbers, KPIs, stuff like that. I've been thinking specifically about numbers in this way, that numbers are constant and perpetually represent a specific thing. And that most everything else in God's creation has some other more dynamic way of being. And yet numbers, math, scientific theories, and equations, once validated, are constants. And it's because of this that the characters then at some point can be so confident in their decision-making that they can almost freely move through the cube. That is to say, they could, like, by knowing the math, like they could just walk through every room just fine. Like there is a literal pathway through the cube. And by the way, we didn't mention, but the cube moves. Like the cubes there's a noise heard, the train you mentioned, that they
Mm-hmm.
quite naturally implemented the noise of this train into the film. And it's not a horn knocking. It's more like a metal
Shh.
shaking. Like it's loud, like a factory. And it's the cube is reorienting, it's moving. And so they can move freely through it because they'll know about, what's safe and what's not. If the cube had food and water and maybe like a singular waste management cube, I'm like, they could just live in it because of how reliable the math is in this cube. Additionally, when they end up believing a section is dangerous, they don't say it's impossible to figure out what to do. Rather, they can seek and adopt a new way of understanding the cube and thus grow in their knowledge of understanding the scenario. The numbers, the science is reliable, irrefutable, and then ultimately helpful. I just find I find, as someone who's fascinated with, obviously I have a movie podcast, who's fascinated with art, and like the way in which like you can engage movies in multiple different ways, whether literally or specifically or from the director's point of view or from my own or whatever I take into it, the eisegetic nature of film. Numbers are exegetical. There is only one way to read numbers, and
Mm-hmm.
and to read it any other way is just ridiculous. Big Brother is incorrect. 2 + 2 does not equal 5, even if Big Brother wants it to. It will always equal 4. And I just find that particularly beautiful about numbers. And I think that this movie creates a fascinating way in which the, I don't know, beauty of numbers is just kind of amazing. At some point they're like, if I can do the math, we can get out. Like, there has to be a way out because they got us in. All right, there must be a way out. And so, it's just. Anyways, what do you think about numbers, Kathryn?
What do I think about numbers? It's now the time to tell you that math was my least favorite subject in school.
What are you talking about? You do math all the time. I see it all the time.
Actually, I honestly do, because I mean, I'm our budget expert, and then also at work. At work, I have to deal with a lot of numbers. But yeah, no, I think what's interesting too, just thinking of like my perspective, is something big in like my workplace, and it's kind of carried over into the way that I think now, is if you can measure something, you can start to tell a story from it. Like the data that you gather from, like work, like you said, like KPIs or statistics or anything like that. Really, when you start looking at numbers as a way of telling a story and facts, like not in subjective, assumptions or anything, but just objective facts.
Yes.
That could be so helpful, especially like in your professional life, but then also, there is a place for it even in your personal life, to be able to do the math, to know the numbers, and from there to actually infer things that are helpful for your life.
Yeah. So like just an example of that, some of the KPIs retail stores will keep track of. And I say broadly because I'm not going to talk about my KPIs.
No.
Or I'm not going to allude that these are, I should say. It is common for KPIs to include things like what's your conversion, what is your average dollars per transaction, and then kind of base it around things like traffic and all these other things. And you can learn when you have a collection of data based on those numbers whether people are buying enough product or not. Because say you had the equivalent amount of traffic from the previous year and your conversion was equal, but you were down in whatever money you made. Well, then you would look at your average dollar transaction and you would probably see that it's down, because how could you have the same amount of traffic, same amount of conversion, but have made less money? Well, it's because people spent less when they kept coming in. And like, I don't even have to give you the numbers to explain what those numbers would represent and what information it would tell you because of that. And it would just be factual. That would just be literally like, there's no other interpretation of that information if all the other information that is important to that is there. Yeah, that's so different to a lot of other forms of communication that we participate in, which is so much more personal or sourced in anecdata. And so, yeah, it's really fascinating.
Well, I mean, I think you also had a good point about how, like the cube is static, the numbers are static, but the humans are unpredictable.
Yes.
I think that, yeah, like there, kind of circling back to your point, there's a part of what we witness within the cube with our characters where they're constantly making assumptions about each other. Like
Yeah.
they're
Yes.
not, again, it's not as easy as looking at Holloway and saying like Holloway's a 7 and 7s always do things this way. To get into Enneagram stuff or like Quentin's definitely a 4 and 4s are always like that. Which is also kind of goofy. Those things can be fun, but anyway, like, they don't function that way. And even, when you do something like an Enneagram test, it might give you some insights into the way that your mind works, but there's still that level of unpredictability with humans.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it's just very interesting because again, the math is there. It's very simple. They can, well, not very simple,
I get it though.
but it's logical.
It's solvable.
It's solvable.
Yeah.
Versus the more complex interpersonal drama that takes place.
Hey there, listener. Want to influence the podcast? Head on over to patreon.com/cinematic doctrine and support the show for $3 a month. In doing so, you'll be able to vote on a movie poll that picks a film we discuss each month. So jump on over there and have your voice heard. Yeah, you had another thing, at least. Your header was finding the human function is what you wrote. Did you want to explain that before we move on?
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of ties in to part of what we've been talking about, where again, like humans are much more unpredictable, and I think that within the movie, as these people are stuck here in the cube, they're wondering like, why are we here? Who did this? How does the cube work? Is this person standing next to me like safe or not? Are they kind of a jerk? I think they're kind of a jerk. I'm getting tired. I'm getting hungry. They're definitely a jerk.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, again, like as we're sitting here with these characters in this situation, we get to have the joy in a strange way of going through these interpersonal issues because the cube is so simple.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, like we have characters like Levin, Renz, and Quentin who are like constantly asking like why and how. Like, why are we here? Why is the cube working this way? How can we get out? Eventually, how can I get out? And again, they're like on varying levels of like a spectrum of using their skills in cooperation or in selfishness.
I get you. Yeah.
Yeah. Like again, like they're convinced there has to be a why and a how, and they might have different ways of getting there, but they kind of function in that way. I like the character of Holloway. I thought it was comical, again, like this altruistic clinic doctor.
Yeah.
Immediately jumps the gun and wants to blame everything on this like evil, faceless organization. They are constantly like, believing the best in the people around them to a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, like saying like, oh, it must be the system.
It's the G-man. Yeah.
It's the G-man that hates us all.
Yeah.
They can't
Great
really
stuff.
face up to the facts. Like they can't look at these other people who are like at certain points just doing objectively awful things or selfish things. They can't look at that objectively, and they also can't, maybe accept the fact that maybe the G-man doesn't have a big plan for this.
Right. Yeah. Maybe there's no motive.
Yeah, maybe there's no why, there's no how. And then we have Worth, who's like constantly just like a wet blanket through the whole thing. Doesn't believe there's a reason or a hope, and he believes like, oh, well, if there is a faceless organization, if it's too stupid to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even a matter of like not caring enough to be evil. It's like, no, like this organization is too stupid and disjointed to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like the end of the movie has a great line where Levin, who's been constantly hopeful to like get out of this and solve the problem, they're getting closer and closer to the end of the cube, and she's like, Worth, like you can see it, like what's out there. And Worth just says, no, there's nothing but boundless human stupidity. And I mean, I'm sure we can find people that like align with that worldview.
Mm-hmm.
The last character that I thought had like a unique function compared to the others was Kazan. Again, the way that they're portrayed, it's easy to infer like they're either, maybe on the autism spectrum or have an intellectual disability or some sort of mental condition. But, Kazan
Not
sees things.
independent at all.
No.
Is very much their portrayal.
Again, like we're watching him engage in like self-injury behaviors where, he's again needing a lot of support to kind of get through the cube.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like he sees things super simply. Like red rooms are bad. Like he loses it. You open up the door, it's red. He's like, I don't want to go there.
Yeah. Yes.
But we find out at the end, like you said, with the super-powered autistic savant that is a really awful trope.
Yeah, I guess that is true. He does have the superpower, doesn't he?
Yeah,
He's
it's
got
a really awful trope. He magically has this superpower and understands the larger meaning of the numbers and ultimately finds like the way toward freedom. So like what's interesting is like you said, like Kazan's like pretty much totally dependent on the group. And then at the very end, like the group is dependent on Kazan.
Right. He's capable of reading the numbers almost instantly and knowing that it's a prime one or not prime.
Yeah, no. And I think there's something to be said in like that interdependence that happens with Kazan's character compared to everybody else, just kind of like, blaming it on the G-Man or different levels of selfishness of like, oh, I got to get out of here.
Yeah. So moving on, we have prominent significant moments and or characters. We'll take this one quickly because it really just goes into the ending. But I had Ren's face melts, which is in the beginning. Ren's had previously escaped several prisons, so it was presumed he may escape the cube. Apart from his death being an early insult to injury scene, it also stands as an example of the inhumane degree in which the cube functions. It's something that can be understood in terms of mapping, but its methods of execution are extraordinarily violent. So it begs the question, is anybody watching? Or why would these be so grotesque at all? It's just a really good... It's a really good scene to add into the film. We already had the opening scene that just like is a combination of spectacle and shock. But now it's happening to the characters that it's like, and it's face violence, head trauma, which is uniquely difficult to watch for a lot of people in movies. And so, and it's different than the kind of head trauma that happens in the opening of the film, because that's his whole body. That's very different. This is like, no, Ren's face melts off. It's just gone. Yes. And it's a good kind of, it's this seed that's tossed into the movie, and it's kind of just and I put it as a significant moment because it's like the only scene after this, or the only scene after the intro, which almost promises more deaths. It's the only scene that has like graphic death, and it's in front of all the characters, and it's a mix of like, it's irony because it's so pointed and happening like right when the characters are like, we're gonna get out of here. Like, this guy's escaped 8 prisons, we'll get out of here, and then boom, dead. So yeah, I wanted to at least mention it because I think it's a good setup. It's a great scene. It's good practical effects too. It looks really gross when they show the face. And so, yeah. What did you? This was your first time seeing the movie. What did you think?
I thought like it was really well executed that when Renz dies, we have this, like you said, like this false sense of security, this reassurance that like, oh yeah, like he's gonna get us out.
We're gonna be all right.
And this is before we find out anything else about any of our characters. Like we don't know at that point that the rooms are tied to math and that Levin is a super whiz college math person.
Right.
We have no clue that Worth might have some sort of, information about how it's constructed,
right?
That might be helpful to get them out. We already know that Quentin's a police officer because he basically introduces himself by saying, "Hi, I'm a police officer." But
police officers are like vegans that way.
Oh no, don't call the vegan police. But Yeah, no, I thought that was very very timely
Yes, it's
whenever
good.
whenever the death had happened.
And the other one I had was Quentin shows his true colors. So Quentin lets Holloway. So Quentin has been kind of the de facto leader at the start because he's very determinative. He's broad, both in personality and also physique, and so he kind of motivates everybody to get started. So there's definitely a social hierarchical dependence that's put onto him, but then Quentin starts to fall apart. We'll say the mask comes off, and we don't
Yes.
just like have these moments where it's like he's being maybe extra, but he becomes kind of like violent. He becomes
Aggressive.
verbally unkind. He gets into an argument that I can't remember if he starts, but he definitely escalates. And then at some point, there's the scene where Quentin, they're basically seeing if they've reached the end of the cube. Their Holloway is the lightest of them, so they're like, let's tie our jumpsuit blazers together, the button up, not blazers. They're not they're not dressed to the nines in this
That
cube.
fancy.
But like they're putting their button ups tied together, and they're gonna have Holloway swing outside the window before the cube moves and see if they can reach, because basically they're inside a cube that moves, and when they peer out the window is a wall, and it's massive and it's completely black. So you're like, how big is this cube and where is it located? You just get no information. Is it underground? Are we in space? Is it inside of a building? Where are we? So they're like, let's at least see if we can swing over to the wall and see if there's anything to grab. So Holloway's out there swinging. She almost falls, so they rush to the window, and Quentin is there and he's pulling her up, and then his smile of like, I've saved you starts to fade, and he turns to a grimace, and Holloway knows like what's about to happen. And Quentin lets her go. She screams. Quentin comes into the room. He's all panicked, and he's like, she slipped. And pretty immediately, like, the characters are a mix of disbelief, but also possible belief. But most importantly, I think they're aware of whether it actually happened because of Quentin or not. Quentin has no like competition now for leader, because Holloway was the one who really pushed against him up until this point.
Yeah.
And it's a real position it's a good moment of characters. It's a good low point in the film. And you kind of knew it was going to happen because it's the kind of movie it is, that one of the characters are going to turn on everybody. But it's also like it's just now there's more than the traps to really be afraid of because a character has killed another character. So I thought it worked out really well as a mix with the others. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely important because like it had been escalating over the course of like the prior 20 minutes before Quentin lets Holloway go, where they're, like you said, they're bickering, they're arguing, and they have like different points of view. One of the biggest things that they run into is whenever they find Kazan in the block, right. Holloway immediately says like, no, like we're bringing him with us. I'll support him. I'll keep him safe. I understand some of these traps might be set off by uncontrollable sounds that Kazan makes. I understand that maybe it'll be more difficult to get him to comply with going into certain rooms. I understand that it might be more challenging for him to do certain things. I'm going to make sure that he gets out of here with us because his life's important too. Yeah. Meanwhile, like Quentin is very quick to go like, no, he's just going to weigh us down.
He's a complete liability.
Yeah. Like, and that's ridiculous. Like, it's also interesting that like both of these characters, Quentin and Holloway, have like careers where they're meant to protect people. And,
yeah, that's interesting.
Like one of them takes an approach that is super empathetic, super like altruistic, and then the other fronts like that for a little bit to get people on his good side. And then again, like the mask drops.
Been itching for Cinematic Doctrine merch? Check out the support tiers on Patreon. We're offering merch to those who support at select tiers. So head on over to patreon.com/Cinematic Doctrine and share your support. There's a link in the show notes too.
It's a good scene. So I think this argument takes place because they find a room that is trapped as per the numbers, but it's not triggering and they're not sure why. And they realize it's sound based. And so then they're like, if we can go through it quietly, we'll make it. So they end up going through it. And Quentin's the last one to go through because since he's the strongest, he's able to, they're going through the cube that's beneath them. And so Quentin's the strongest one to be able to lift them down into the cube and they can crawl through. Quentin is just about to make it through. I think something almost like triggers the trap and they freak out. But then they're fine. And then Kazan like lets out a noise in celebration that is like, yay, you made it. But it's just like a noise. But it triggers the trap. So Quentin dives through. I think he gets his leg cut. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But he almost gets killed and he's just losing it. And I think he like roughs up Kazan a little. And then that's when Holloway like calls him out. This is when you pointed out a good line of dialogue that like sets up like she alludes like overtly like and it's a good setup for a line of dialogue, I should say, where like she's like, are you treating him like how you treated your family? Because he had shared like he's a police officer, but he's single now. And there's some good drama there, actually. We didn't talk about it with him and Levin, but the whole
the ick factor.
The ick factor, yeah. But he's like, I'm divorced now. And Holloway just goes for the jugular. Is like, are you treating Kazan like you treated your son? That's why your wife divorced you. Is something like that is what she says.
Well, yeah,
brutal.
No. like their argument is killer. Because like, again, he goes for the jugular and he's like, I know your type. Like you've never had a man to be with you and you're just all dried up and you're old and
you're nasty.
Bleeding heart. Like I'm mopping up after it, while you're trying to save everyone. Like he's just super nasty. But it was very interesting for me to catch that line where, again, it's alluded to in the beginning of the film, like, oh, he's divorced, trying to reconcile with his family or visit them. He wants to get out of here to see them. So like you have this, it's giving you a reason to root for this character. And then again, like you watch as more things kind of drop through. And again, like in their argument, something comes up along the lines of like, she is reading between the lines to say like, oh no, like you roughed up your kids like this too, didn't ya?
Right.
You roughed up your wife like this too, didn't ya?
Which is common statistically regarding sports fans and police officers. And so it is a film that's aware of these things. And not that he's a sports fan, but he is a police officer. And it's a good underhanded like angle to it, not a good underhanded angle. It's a good subversion of like a consistent trope of like the trapped hero who is maybe divorced, but he has the opportunity, or maybe is going through a divorce. And you hope by the end of the film, they have the opportunity to meet love again, to make corrections, and the opposite happens in this movie where it's like they could be setting those pieces up. And then by the end, it's like, oh no, she made the right choice. This guy's a monster.
Well, it's like a comparison. My brain's forever rotted because of Homestuck, but a comparison would be the movie Con Air, where you have this character where you're like, oh my goodness, why is Nick Cage here in this high security airplane with John Malkovich
and a bear, the stuffed bear?
Yeah, and the bunny, the little.
That's
bunny.
What it was, the bunny. Yeah.
But yeah, like
good movie.
You have that sort of trope where it's like, here's our hero. He's finally being released to go back to his loving wife and kid, and he's hoping to reconcile with them. And so you're like, yeah, Nick Cage, like get it, like no matter what you got to do, you got to get off this plane, you got to land it and be safe.
Excuse me, Nicholas Jesus with that head of hair.
Well, yeah, yeah, he's sporting a whole look in that movie. But yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like it's a good subversion. Again, it's like a total heel turn that you can see from a mile away. You can see it from a mile away.
But the line that you liked was after Quentin lets go of Holloway and she falls to her death. There's a later line where Worth is like arguing with Quentin, I think, or Levin. I can't remember which one. And they're like, you let Holloway go. And he's like defending himself like, no, she fell. And then he finally goes, I let her go because she knew. And that's all he says.
Oh.
And you were like, that's a great line. I was like, why? And he's like, because he's outing himself. He's saying she knew about the abuse without ever knowing. Like she
Yeah.
was able to deduce the truth of his life, basically, all while within this cube.
Yeah. And meanwhile, like she's probably just like spouting out the first insult she can think
First
of.
insult, this
right?
first like sting. And he goes the extra mile to save face.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting, because the movie never goes the route of making unrealistic decisions, in my opinion. Like all of the humans make natural decisions. So it's an interesting display of the way in which people will defend the most heinous things in the most obscure scenarios. Here's this man defending awful behavior or hiding awful behavior in the cube from Cube. Why? Like the more people you have, likely the more opportunity you have to survive. And so like it's like it's so, sin is so senseless, evil is so senseless, but it defends itself so aggressively. So it's, anyways, it's a good line, and it's a good moment for these characters. So it's great. Like you'll be itching for traps watching this movie because of the promise of the opening of the film and then the way Renz dies. But I believe that most people, while watching the film, will find the character drama and a lot of that stuff satisfactory.
Want some quick updates on the podcast? Follow the Cinematic Doctrine Instagram for cool posts and story updates. Press the link in the show notes or search Cinematic Doctrine, that's one word, in your Instagram app. Oh, and we're on Threads. Check us out there too.
So just to define the ending, what essentially happens is they're able to dodge Quentin. They're able to get far away from him, and then the cubes, I think, move around or something like that. Because Levin is able to do the math. Levin and Kazan are able to do the math. Yes. Quentin is not able to. And then Worth has like partnered with them. I alluded to the stuff with Quentin and Levin. Basically, Quentin, who has outed himself as a divorced person, but also is the powerful one in the group. And Levin, who is... they don't say
at best.
19 at best, because you don't hear, you don't know if she's in high school and you don't know if she's in college.
Well,
and she's coded young.
I think they said she was a college student, but she still lives at home with her mom and dad. Like she makes that super clear. She went to bed in her childhood bedroom.
Yes, and then she woke up in the cube. And so, what a nightmare. And so, after they set this up, and the movie doesn't display this in a way that's positive. I think it displays it in a way that's intriguing and mysterious. It sets up that like Levin is tying herself to Quentin, kind of as the powerful one, and like that there might be something going on. I think Quentin makes an overt pass as like,
oh yes,
when we get out, let's go get dinner or something. It's like,
yes, and like he's like twice her age.
He's like, yeah, he's not. I was about to say he's so old. He's not old. But he's old compared to her. And the movie's good at making it like he's not being overly creepy, but in a very modern sense, this is wrong. This is inappropriate. And so, but by this point now, Levin is like, no, you killed him. And there's great lines where like Levin is just like, I'm not putting up with you, Quentin. None of them are putting up with Quentin. Anyway, so Levin is now partnered with Worth, who Worth early on seems skeevy, but then as the film goes on, becomes more a compassionate character. He's more reasonable. And Levin, Worth, and Kazan are now at the end. They figured out that basically because the cube is constantly moving, there must be an exit because that's how we were put in anyway. And they inevitably learn that it's actually the room that most of them woke up in. So they weren't even put that far into the cube, which is I didn't realize this, but that probably means the people who built the cube didn't want to separate everybody too much because they were afraid of getting stuck in the cube. So they probably just put them in the elevator entrance and then just let the cube move, because the cube then takes the entrance, moves it around throughout the cube, and then inevitably will go back to the entrance. And so now they're in this room. Quentin is nowhere to be seen. The door opens. Kazan is going through. And then right as Levin, I think, is about to, a spike goes through her. Quentin has gotten into the room. He has broken open one of the handles and killed her. Worth and Quentin are now fighting. Kazan is freaking out, but Worth keeps Quentin trapped long enough so that Kazan is able to get out. Because Quentin then tries to get out the door too, but Worth is holding on to him. And then the cube starts to move, and
Yeah.
Quentin is in the doorway. And so you get this really good implied scene of it's like a wide shot of the cube from the outside moving. And so you're like, oh gosh, he just got split in half. And then the cube moves, and there's just a stretched out blood stain across the wall of the cube. We don't see anything else in the cube. Worth is now alive inside the cube, but probably not for long.
2 dead bodies.
Because there's 2 dead bodies, well, 1.5. And 1.5 dead bodies. And Worth is, as is every character, probably dehydrated, malnourished. They're all chapped-lipped at this point. So he's probably dead in the next couple hours. And then Kazan, we see Kazan, who turns around. There's this blinding light. He walks into it. Credits roll. That's the end of the movie. And I think it's very satisfactory. I think the ending is a good climax. You feel relief. They found the exit. And then you get this one extra moment of tension when Quentin comes in to fight. But I think it's a good ending. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I know you had said earlier in the episode that this is not elevated horror.
I saw the metaphor. I know what you're saying. I pick it up.
I beg to differ. Like, I would much rather. I find way more interest in talking about like the bigger picture of the metaphor.
What does it mean?
Yeah. Like, I'm over here with like the one group of characters going like, but why? How?
Right.
Why? And I don't know. I don't know if you fall into the G-Man category, but you know. Anyway, to really, just sum up my thoughts about the ending. I think that what I kind of drew from the pieces that were being played with over the course of the movie is that, like, I came to the conclusion that the cube is like mostly a metaphor for life, but it's also a very cold and uncaring type of life that, like, honestly kind of poses the idea that, in this world, if there is a God, they must also be like just as cold and uncaring as the cube that they've made. Or, maybe there isn't a God and the cube's just unfortunate. It's a happenstance. It's perpetuated by a bunch of stupid humans who only see a percentage of what they're actually contributing. And I think towards the end, if I had to like give a thesis statement for the ending, it would be the hope in the movie is found in overcoming the human condition at the end of it all. Like the human condition of fear and selfishness and violence and foolishness and despair, and like actually working together for something. Like you have to find something worth living for. You can't just focus on the negative sharp edges of the cube. And I think that's just kind of like super on the nose with like Kazan being the one that ultimately survives at the end. This idea that like the pure in heart are the ones that are going to see the face of God. They're the ones that are the closest to like the goodness. They're the ones that have overcome the human condition of, sin, essentially. So yeah, like that's my elevated horror read. Again, the ending of the movie, even just down to the fact that like Quentin murders Levin, and it's because of this rage and this violence that he ultimately gets held back and trapped forever.
Yeah, they were at the exit. He could have left.
Yes. They all could have walked out. They all could have walked out. And I think it even says even more so about Worth's character, who, like you said, like at the beginning is kind of scummy. Like he's a guy that's like bragging about his porn collection for some reason.
He makes a joke about it. I don't think he's bragging, but he
makes a joke about but he's like, oh no, I'm not married outside of here. Like I just go to my 9 to 5 and like I have, porn to keep me company.
I think Holloway's like, you have to have something you're trying to get out of here for. And he's like, I have a very nice collection of pornography.
So dumb.
And everyone's like, come on.
but again, like I think this movie does a good job of like uncovering more about these characters, and I think it says a lot that at the end, Worth, that's just kind of been along for the ride, cynical, is the one who ultimately ends up sacrificing himself to make sure that Kazan can make it out. Like at least someone can make it out, and that Quentin isn't there to stop them all.
So I make jokes about elevated horror, but I definitely see what you're saying. And I agree. I do think that the film is like that. I also try to avoid the metaphor is life thing because I think that that's so many movies.
Yeah, that's so broad.
but I agree. I think the film, you could see it as a nihilistic depiction of God. I think it's not really a film thinking about God because they talk
No.
more about man, and they make very clearly that like it's man that made this bar minimum. Like it had to be at least that. And in that way, there is like a nihilism produced out of it because it's so disgusting that man made it at all. And it doesn't even have to be real for anybody to think of similar man-made institutions or programs that seem just as awful. Like the regular millennial joke is like, how are there unpaid interns? How is that legal? Like that is an institution that is insane.
Or even,
thing to be
I mean,
alive.
it's so on the nose too with everyone being named after a prison. You know,
Well, yes,
all
that's
other
also
forms
true.
of slavery, right? Like here in the U.S., no. But you go to a prison and you're like, oh wow, like they're still doing this,
Right. And to have then these like different forms of people displayed there, where
Yes.
like when you mentioned that Holloway was based off this prison that's like actually quite like that's the point of prison is
Nice.
reform. It's like
Yes.
then she's, even though she's a little cuckoo, she's also like gentle and kind and able to like find ways to probably make things work. Yeah, so I like that, and I think that's also one of its strong points as a film, and part of why the ending is also fascinating, as Quentin, as the villain, essentially goes on this murder spree, because it's like you could just freaking get out if you all work together. Like you don't have to continue this vendetta. But now that he's outed himself, and everybody knows he's like a wife beater or a child abuser, like he can't let any of these people go. So it's definitely fascinating in that way. Yeah, I feel like I had a couple more thoughts regarding that, but I don't know if I do, other than just that like the movie at its best, in my opinion, like final thoughts on Cube, the whole package is great. The directing of it is all very good, and the characters and the performance and just like the mystery and mystique of it all is just an amazing package. It is so good and so enjoyable that like honestly, this watch is rewatchable. Like I almost want to just rewatch it again pretty soon. So maybe for Halloween I'll put it back on. Yeah, I think the movie is good. That's it. That's all I got. What about you? What do you think about the movie in summation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very good, very enjoyable. Again, just like the technical prowess in the design, the directing, the even the practical effects, really, really good. Yeah, it was a good watch. It was not as boring as some other stuck in impossible to escape scenario movies.
Some of them are very boring.
This is one of the good ones.
You may not know this, but the easiest way you can show your support for Cinematic Doctrine is to rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. So press pause and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And then press play again so you can hear the rest of the show.
So that's all I got. What do we got for recommendations? What do you got?
Yeah, so I'm about halfway through Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. It's a part of the
Zone X series, I think is what it's called.
Yeah, Area X.
Area X.
Or like the first book's Annihilation movie, also pretty good. But yeah, I would recommend this on the basis of, you know, if you are into reading and if you like weird science fiction like Cube, then there's a good chance you'll like Authority. Again, like you can start off reading Annihilation, the first book in the series, to kind of learn the basics about Area X, which is this strange event that's overtaking a small coastal southern town in the United States. Authority has a totally different feel than Annihilation did, but Authority is kind of the story that we go through there is kind of what I would imagine it would look like on the outside of the Cube, where you have some detached desk jockey secret agent guy going about his first few weeks on the job, like not in the cube, but close to it. And then in Authority, they also pepper in some things where like he's having, things from his past come up and strange visions about this cliff and, trying to uncover the mystery of Area X, all the while like never actually being in Area X.
Yeah, as opposed to Annihilation, where it's all in Area X.
Yeah.
And also short. So further encouragement to read both, because I think I think I finished Annihilation in like one sitting. It's like 180 pages or something.
Yeah, and I also believe, and I just want to double check here. So Jeff Vandermeer is also an author from Pennsylvania, so represent.
Yeah. I'm going to recommend Saw. I've, of course, recommended Saw 6 previously on the podcast. So it's silly that I'm recommending the first film now, but you can definitely watch them out of order. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's more fun in order. Not all of them are great, but some of them are really fun. So the first Saw, though, is very much a thriller movie. Does not contain what the series turns into, which is more like torture, violence stuff. And when the movies are good, they're really, really good because they're so over the top. But this movie is very, I would almost say, understated. There's very few traps, and it's very thrilling, and the threat is there. And part of, I think, what's so compelling about them is just by visual alone, the threat is felt. So the most notorious of the traps is the head bear trap. It's the reverse bear trap. It's a bear trap that is, I think it's closed, but it's closed in reverse, and it's grabbing both of your jaws. And the idea is that after a minute, it snaps open, which means your head splits open from the jaw, and you would just die or bleed out, I guess. So, which is worse? I don't know. I think that there's a lot of brilliance in that. The fact that the film, on a very inexpensive budget, which people may not know, but is a very cheaply made movie, is able to cause so much physical and emotional engagement. I think that's very impressive. The film also is very compelling. It's like, as I described it to my mom when I bought it for her for Christmas one year, I said, first off, you read Dean Koontz all the time, so you'll enjoy reading this. I don't even know if they read that anymore. They just read it when I grew up. But then I also said, you watch a lot of cop shows like CSI. And I'm like, Saw, the first movie, is basically a CSI episode. And then a couple of the movies after that are also like CSI episodes, just way more graphic. And so this first movie, though, is way more CSI because these two characters wake up in this bathroom. It's very spacious. One person is on one side. One person is on the other. They're both tied and they're locked in. And then there's a dead body on the floor in the middle. And there's a series of clues that they have to complete. So it's an escape room, basically. And they're trying to figure out what they have in common. They're trying to figure out who might know them and have put them in the situation. So you're getting scenes of them figuring out how to get out of these traps. On the inside of this, how to get out of this one trap with the bathroom. And then getting scenes of their outside life and learning that they may not be so innocent or may not be so truthful as they're talking to each other. It's a good movie. And I think people who haven't seen it may not understand why the franchise became what it is. But by watching the first film, which is incredibly accessible, I think it'll click. Right after that is when the series becomes much more violent, which I think I enjoyed too. I think it's a good stuck in impossible to escape scenario type film. I know some people don't like 2. I think 3. I don't like 3 at all. But after 3 is when the franchise starts to make some of the most bizarre and entertaining decisions a series could ever make. And that only makes sense if you've seen the 3rd film to completion and then learn that there are 7 more movies because it makes no sense. And of all films, the continuity is bonkers, and it's been completely ruined by the film Jigsaw, which came out a couple of years ago. It's one of the more recent ones. I think it's like Saw 8. Jigsaw completely demolishes the continuity of this film series. It's amazing. And anyways, become one of us is what I'm saying, because as I'm pitching this single film, I'm also pitching the franchise. And yeah, there's so much entertainment to be sucked out of this film series.
Yeah.
So
I mean, if you don't see like the prior 9 movies, 10 movies, then you can't get to whenever Jigsaw goes on his Mexican vacation.
Yeah, it's one of the most grotesque films ever. It's so great. Really great scenes in that movie. I can't wait for Saw 11 this year. So excited. I'm genuinely so excited.
Are we counting the Chris Rock movie?
That technically is counted in the series, even though that one is not good. It's such a disappointment, that one. Chris Rock is fine in it, but that movie sucks. Anyways, yeah, check out Saw, the first film. If you like it, check out the rest. I think they're quite entertaining, and Saw 6 is an extreme highlight. Saw 7, disappointing, but still good. Jigsaw, visually very good film. I thought that film looked good compared to the rest. Now I'm just recommending them all. And then Saw X is a great film. Totally good on its own. Really good film. But yeah, Saw 6 is probably the highlight. It's the best one. Anyways, thanks for tuning into this episode, and thanks for joining me for this one, Kathryn.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks so much for checking out this episode of Cinematic Doctrine. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving a review and subscribing to the podcast. And as mentioned before, Cinematic Doctrine has a Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you're opted into a once-a-month movie poll where you decide a movie we discuss on the podcast. There are other unique benefits that come with supporting the podcast, so be sure to check that out at patreon.com/Cinematic Doctrine. A special shout out to those who support at the Art House Theater tier on Patreon. Thank you so much, Mom, Dad, Melanie, Shirleyan, and Thomas. You guys are the best, and your continued monetary support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, stay cool. Want some Cinematic Doctrine swag? You're in luck. We've got 3-inch Cinematic Doctrine logo stickers exclusive for Patreon supporters. Perfect for your travel mug or laptop. Head over to patreon.com/Cinematic Doctrine, link in the show notes, and choose the Independent Theater tier. Doing so will net you other perks too. But let's be real, the podcast stickers are the coolest perk. So get yourself some podcast stickers by supporting on Patreon.